Let me send all of you a warm welcome today. We know it's a busy week, it's a busy month in a difficult year. So that's why we are quite glad that we have you here as an audience for this live webinar. As you saw, we will record it and make it available via YouTube. So you can also share it and forward it to colleagues that couldn't join us today. My name is Sebastian Becker. I'm the Managing Director of the German Blockchain Association, aka Bundesblock, and we are an association of more than 100 members, focusing predominantly on the German markets, German-speaking markets and Germany, but of course we worry about pan-European tendencies and also about Germans living and working abroad. So that's why I'm quite pleased to have Professor Frank Tietze today with us and his colleagues Damiano and Severin. They have teamed up to form Alps, a new Web3 based IP licensing platform. So we want to use the occasion today to take a look at this project that was spun off the University of Cambridge and to talk about this great opportunity for future Web3 and blockchain-based business modeling in this webinar about the future of IP licensing. So with this, I would like to ask Frank to take the stage and to give us his introductory presentation about Alps and the future of IP licensing. Frank, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, for the introduction and also for this opportunity to be part of today's webinar. We have started this journey a few years ago now, and this is a project that has been growing out of my research lab here, as you said, at the University of Cambridge. We're based at the engineering department. And I have a research group that looks at innovation processes from an IP perspective. And over the years, we've been playing around with different technologies to explore different use cases for it, such as AI, but also distributed ledger technologies. And some years ago now, we came up with this abbreviation that we call Alps for Automated Licensing Payment Systems, which also became the name of our spin-out, but is more meant to be an acronym for this type of payment solutions that are based on distributed ledgers that automate licensing. So it's a bit like Kanban or other types of operation management concepts. So it's like an acronym for a group of systems that are kind of in the Web 3.0 facilitate IP licensing. And to give you a bit of an idea, this is how the kind of classical licensing process looks like. It's very linear. It goes from the left, from the IP creators who create IP that is bundled up in products, component, or services, which are then licensed to manufacturers who distribute these products and produce them and distribute them to end users. And then eventually from right to left, there are some payment flows, and there are various issues in these payment flows, various inefficiencies in the kind of in this kind of still existing paradigm. So the IP creators are actually disconnected from the use of their IP. So they don't really participate in the usage. If they've developed something that is very valuable, gets frequently used, they might only get a kind of standard royalty. Then, and in this context, actually licensing contracts are often, and licensing models, royalty models are often very simplistic because of the way how that semi-manual process is actually set up at the moment. So pay-per-use models that we now see being rolled out everywhere in the digital economy are really not possible. And I should say here that we are actually looking at this from an industrial perspective. So these things are also happening in the kind of creative industries. But we came to this from the kind of Internet of Things, Industry 4.0 perspective. And then because there are lots of many inefficiencies and inaccuracies in that process, actually these IP creators spent a lot of money on audits that really don't add value, but I mean, pay some intermediaries who conduct these audits, but they don't really add any value, but rather they take away value that could otherwise go to the IP creators. And the users on the other side, they are also not really benefiting from the kind of inefficiencies in the licensing process. They might eventually be able to participate in such a way that they could consume products and services cheaper. So summing this up, there's basically a trust problem between various parties being involved in this kind of licensing ecosystem, and the current process is inaccurate and basically expensive. And to give you an example, you might have heard about that company called Arm, which is Intel's biggest competitor, based in Cambridge and grown out of Cambridge. This is they run a license-based business model with more than 500 licensees globally, and it's estimated that they basically sink 3 to 4 million euros or dollars or pounds every year just on tech audits, which could really be spent and is money that could be rather put to use to add value somewhere in that licensing process. So to give you an idea of what we're thinking, how the future might look like if you actually digitize that licensing process and the associated ecosystem. So here are 3 examples, and maybe I just pick one. So the automotive industry, that is a bit in trouble in Germany at the moment, but is also vitally important for the German industry. That could look quite differently, and particularly this kind of the secondary sales market or the rental market. So in the future, you might be able to customize the car when you rent a car, or even to when you buy a used car, you could enable certain features that the previous owner might not have wanted. And if you then do that, then the associated licensing payment for all that IP that sits within those components could be triggered automatically, even though the activation of these features is disconnected in time and space from the original point of purchase. So this is all about hardware activation of features, and then you need to have a trustworthy process in place to trigger the associated royalty payments. And we think the system we've kind of thought about that could actually make that happen. And to put a few numbers to that, we've already seen the Arm example, but if we just look at these 4 companies, Nokia, Qualcomm, Ericsson, some of the world's biggest licensing companies, they have a licensing income of about 7.5 billion per year. And if one estimates the audit cost, they're about a bit more than 40 million lost for these companies in terms of what they spent on audits. So really non-value adding cost expenses. If they could be funneled back to the creators, that would add more value. And the global tech audit market, that's also involves some of the big companies we all know, and that's estimated to be 5 billion annually. So 5 billion pounds or dollars or euros again, approximately lost every year, that could rather benefit IP creators. And we need that in the kind of creative industries. But again, our focus is on more the B2B industries. So these cost savings can go back to the IP creators. But then if through automation, you can actually increase the accuracy of the royalty payments just for these 4 companies together, that would create an additionally 100 million pounds of extra value that they could kind of generate from this. And then, as I kind of outlined a little bit with that automotive example, you can actually do much more licensing models that are much more fit for purpose for the kind of digital connected Web3 world. And that comes with additional kind of commercial opportunities. So this is a bit of an introduction. We think that rather linear picture in the future should rather change to something that looks a bit more like an ecosystem network, where you have these royalty distribution platforms for automating these processes. And then you have payment flows going directly to tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers instead of trickling back to those with kind of value lost with all its steps. So I think I'll stop there and hand back to Sebastian for moving us into the next phase of this webinar.
Thanks a lot, Frank. That was quite insightful. I have one quick question about, I think it was one slide before, when you talked about revenue increases based on increased accuracy of the audit processes. And I couldn't really read the small print there. Where does this number or thinking comes from? Because if there is accuracy, it could also mean less revenues, of course, depending on where the accuracies are found.
Yes. So the fine print is not meant to be read, but there are some assumptions in the footnotes here.
Okay,
so basically, the conflict of interest that creates tensions and trust problems in the licensing process is that licensors and licensees have not aligned target objectives, right? So the licensees, they want to minimize the royalties that they have to pay to the licensors, and on the other hand, licensors want to maximize their income, so the royalty they receive from licensees. And here we have the perspective of the licensors, and the assumption here is if they would just, through that automation, would be able to get an additional percentage of income because because of that conflict of interest and tensions that licensees rather tend to underpay than overpay, then that's a big sum of money that we're talking about.
Understood perfectly. And a second question, do you think, and depending on how Alps works in detail, do you think that a certain number of or a certain percentage of IT is suited to be monitored and managed by Alps, while some other licenses or IP rights, for whatever reason, might not be suitable? So is there a percentage that you would guesstimate?
We've been discussing that for quite a while, and we've not been able to put a number down to that, also because there's generally not much data being published about licensing markets. Licensing contracts tend to be confidential, and there's not much information out there, a bit more in the creative industries, but again, we're focusing on the industrial setting. However, what one can say is that not all use cases of the the current licensing processes that are happening across the world, not all of these will find this interesting, because a lot of licensors, but also licensees, they make money out of intransparency, and they leverage these inefficiencies. And audit companies clearly are one of those intermediaries that one could possibly in the future cut out. So this is has a bit of disruptive character. And there are certain actors in the innovation and licensing ecosystems who have no interest to go through that system. However, what we've learned so far by speaking to quite many different stakeholders is that everybody agrees that eventually this is one of the many business processes that eventually will get digitized. It's just a question of when it will get digitized, and then it's a question of which technical solutions. Will this really be based on distributed ledgers or blockchain, or could this also be done by classical IT architectures?
And of course, we assume that blockchain is the most suited technology here. Speaking about technology, do you want to, or Damiano, do you want to tell us a little bit more about the underlying technology and what you have decided to base Alps on?
Of course. So I want to try to share my screen and let's see.
Do you want to talk to this slide, Damiano?
Sure, if you prefer. So basically, as Frank said, we have these nice promises, automation, increase in accuracy and everything. How can we deliver? How can we complete, fulfill our promises? Well, as was hinted, we go through blockchain and especially smart contracts. What is the great advantage there is that, as hopefully most of people are familiar with smart contracts in the audience. So what is the novel feature of a smart contract that gets magically executed by the network? So what does it mean? It means that it's not like a traditional program that is either executed by some centralized party or one of the parties involved, but it's out of our hands. So it's beyond the reach and, more importantly, the tamperability and the influence of the parties involved. In this scenario, when we talk about parties involved, we're talking about the licensor and the licensee, mainly, if we think about two entities license agreement. What does it mean in practice? It means that the licensee, who traditionally is the entity that is tasked with computing the royalty, no longer has this task, as this the royalty to be paid gets computed by the network, so by the smart contract. This is achievable by translating a license agreement, so a human-readable legal contract, into a smart contract. So a piece of code that can be executed on the DLT. This means that we have two stages. So the setup stage or the deployment stage when this contract gets created and deployed. And this is an important stage because the smart contract, once it is deployed, it will carry on, compute results. So act as it is instructed in its code. So how its coding dictates. And this is great because it means that no cheating can happen, but also can be an issue because this immutability may be a problem if there are mistakes and errors, if there are bugs, the code itself. This is why in our scenario, we have a first translation step when we extract the royalty logic from the license agreement, the human document, and we automatically translate that into smart contracts, which is, we call it a smart contract bundle. It's just a set of interconnected smart contracts that are needed for the royalty computation. What happens at this stage is that there is a back and forth process between the licensor and the licensee to make sure that they agree on the smart contract or on the smart license, so on this smart contract bundle, so that no mistakes are added or no intentional deviation from the original logic are added by any of the two parties. No one of the two can cheat because to be deployed, this smart license need to be signed by both parties, so both the licensor and licensee, which is kind of a stamp of approval. Yes, we agree. Now that the smart license is deployed, then we are in the second phase, which is the smart license lifecycle. And in this case, this is where, let's say, it's beyond the reach of the entities. It will carry on its operation as intended in its coding. And of course, in this stage, it's very important where we get the royalty-based values from. Your royalty computation can be as perfect and as detailed as you want, but if the input data is misleading, is wrong, then of course you will get a wrong computation, a wrong result in the end. And this is a big topic in general in DLTs and blockchain in general, because the blockchain, the smart contracts inside the blockchain only have visibility inside the blockchain, so on the data that is written there. And our smart licenses, which are smart contracts, are no exception. Now, as you can see, you might be a little scared and say, okay, but here we're talking about smart contracts, about technical details. I am just a lawyer. I want to work with licenses. I know nothing about all the programming languages needed in this case. Well, as we can see in this picture, actually, we've talked about that, and we do provide a set of tools that are allowed to interface the user with the underlying system, with the underlying DLT, in the most intuitive and transparent, easy to access way as possible. In particular, here we see some screenshots from our DApp. So we have developed a DApp, so decentralized application that users can run locally, and by interfacing with the underlying blockchain, which in this case, this comes from our, let's say, demo setup. And in this case, we are running an Ethereum clone. So we have basically a permissioned version of Ethereum, which has a little number of nodes that run in a permissioned environment, and they manage the entire chain. So we link our dApp to the backend, which is the chain itself. And now the users can deploy new smart licenses, so deploy new smart contracts, or interact with the existing one, which means, for example, here we can see a bunch of graphs. Why? Because those are the users monitoring their own smart licenses, how much they're gaining in royalties or how much they're paying, depending on the role they have in the system. So it's, you don't need a very strict technical knowledge to be able to appreciate the advantages. And by advantages, as Frank said, we mean not just the automation, because you do not have to issue any action. Everything happens automatically. You just say, refresh, compute the new royalty, and everything happens in the backend automatically. But sorry, but also from a point of view of interpreting those results. It's kind of not really easy to see in these pictures, as it's kind of small and in the background with all these like dots and sets that you can see. But another important point of the whole system, because it's another trouble point in general of DLTs and blockchain in particular, is the scalability. So this system is great, may be great, but if it cannot scale up to real world needs, then of course it's useless, cannot be really used. This is not a problem of Alps in particular, it's a problem of many DLT protocols and blockchain in particular in the wild that nowadays plague, let's say, blockchain technology. And how do we want to approach this? Our idea is to use say a federated network approach, which basically means that we have different networks, each one running its own DLT system that interact with each other. And by interact, we mean that they exchange, so they communicate by exchanging the needed data for a smart license residing on network 1 to that needs some data that comes from network 2. So if our smart license has the royalty computation has some royalty-based values that are produced or are present on another network, then we need some cross-chain communication protocols that allow us to then carry on with our network. Here we see the image of IoT devices, right? So let's think about an example where there's some data feed from the IoT device is what is providing the royalty-based values. For example, here there is a little picture you see of a phone, because we have developed also an Android application, Android app that you can deploy on your phone. And this is just to provide us with some data to, in this case, it's about the usage of the phone. So we consider the phone as an IoT device, and we just measure network usage, torch, screen time, and so on as sensors. Okay. So we get this data, okay, and let's say that this data is somehow important not to be disclosed. Because, for example, it comes from a factory that is producing something, and we have the IoT. Thank you. The IoT device is deployed on the robot, on the machine building something. Well, this data may provide an unfair advantage to the competitors if it gets publicly disclosed, so we do not want that. At the same time, we want this data flow to be usable, to be consumable by our smart licenses to compute royalties, because we may have to pay someone, by the number of devices produced, for example. The IoT device only counts devices passing by. Okay, so how do we solve this? This is a classical problem, again, in DLT systems. How do we propose to achieve this? Is by having a mixed visibility model in the networks, in the federated network that we said before. So each individual network not only has a different, let's say, consortium that protects the network. So a different set of validators inside that manage the network, but also may impose or may choose different visibility properties. For example, we may have a network, in that case, a private blockchain running on the factory that contains all these counting device, number of device produced data. And still, we need some privacy-preserving cross-chain communication algorithm or step protocol that allows us to then move these to a network where the smart license that needs this data resides. And this is what we are currently developing. This is, of course, an open problem in general in research. We do have at least 2 working solutions that we are currently discussing in the academic field. I mean, Alps, as you said in the beginning, is spin-off of the University of Cambridge, so we have an high connection with the academia and research. So many of these solutions are still highly, say, experimental, let's say, but they are working. We are actually under review. We have some academic work presenting the findings and the results. So this can be done. At the moment, it's a bit expensive, but the current goal is in this. Let's provide privacy-preserving cross-chain communication to allow for the usage, so consuming private data as a royalty base for our licenses, right? Without, of course, impacting scalability. Otherwise, it will be useless. Does it make any sense? And I do apologize, I'm sick, so probably hard to read too here.
Yeah, no, we could understand you properly. So thank you for that summary. Also, I have 2 quick remarks or questions to you. So you talked about some of the problems that are, as you said, of course, not exclusive to Alps, but general problems in the blockchain sector, scalability. And yes, we see layer 2s and layer 3s solving this. And I think also the cross-chain communication part or exchange of data oracles is also right now at a focus not only of academia, but also of many blockchain ecosystems. So I think that we can get, let's say, a good toolbox of solutions and readily programmed APIs in the near future available for this. But I also wanted to jump back to your introduction when you said that basically you have this smart contract creation engine where you basically turn underlying contracts into smart license contracts. And if we think of some of the bigger consortia that existed in the, let's say, contract space, most of you might remember the B3I consortium initiated by Munich Re and Allianz. And they wanted to digitize basically all the contracts between reinsurance companies and the first insurers. And in the end, after 3 years, they stopped the project because they said, well, if you don't put smart contracts conditions or smart contract compatible conditions in the underlying insurance contracts, then basically you're only digitizing paper and you cannot get the benefits of more efficient execution. So it seems that you have solved this problem. I'm pretty sure from a legal standpoint, there might be some question marks, but we will cover this in the panel for sure. So thank you for your introduction, Damiano, about the underlying technology. And with that, let's jump right into the panel. And apart from Frank, I would like to invite Alex and Severin to join us. And let's maybe start with a quick round of introduction. And Alex, maybe you go first.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sebastian. So my name is Alex. I'm located in Germany. I hold a law degree. I'm also holding an IT degree. I did a master in blockchain technologies. Alps is already a little familiar to me. I spoke with Frank in the past about it. It's quite interesting concept. I really like it, and I'm looking forward to dive now into our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. You're, of course, also a member of the board of Bundesblock, newly elected last month. So welcome again. First appearance in public in one of our webinars. And with this being said, over to Severin.
Yes, just trying to find the unmute button. Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to see you. So my name is Severin. I'm also based in Germany. I currently help the Alps team with business development efforts. I'm also studying a PhD with the University of Osnabrück, focusing on distributed ledger technology and blockchain. Before that, my professional background has been in the IP industry, more specifically in the compliance side of things. So a lot of software compliance, working both with proprietary and then later on open source software companies. I've been personally an IT or IP auditor at the beginning of my career, auditing royalty contracts, software contracts, and I can certainly appreciate the pain points that Alps Vision is trying to address. Specifically, what I've seen in my career was, basically the fact that IP licensing and IP contracts are very complex. And right now, the only way the industry is trying to address the complexity is to use this big four audit firms to do these audits. And as Frank mentioned already, these audits are costly, not only because it's expensive to hire a big four firm, but also costly on the customer satisfaction side of things. So I've been from the start very interested to see what Alps' vision was to try and address these real life challenges from the IP industry. I look forward to discussing with the panel and the folks in the call how we can drive this in the future.
Thanks, Seb, and also welcome to Uni Osnabrück. You also joined Bundesblock earlier this year, so also the first, let's say, public appearance here in this webinar. Frank, you gave the introductory presentation, but please say a few words about you with your German background, working in Cambridge, and you mentioned ARM as one of the unicorns that basically came out of the Cambridge campus. So what kind of also triggered the idea for Alps for you?
Sure. Again, thank you very much, Sebastian and the Bundesblock for hosting us here. I've, as you said, I have German roots, originally did industrial engineering, came to Cambridge about 10 years ago and had this unique opportunity to actually launch a research group embedded in the engineering department, where we look at innovation processes from an IP perspective. So we have a range of different research projects. And this is really just one of them, but we have been working quite a bit on IP strategies, also linked to kind of sustainability issues. And while we initially were quite focused on patents in our research, we've also branched out into kind of software IP and generally a bit more the soft IP, know-how, trade secrets, etc. But we have this engineering view on IP and innovation processes, and through that freedom that I have, we could really explore the use case here of blockchain for this kind of use case. And as you've asked, where did this idea originally came from? Actually, at some point when blockchain came around, I picked up a book, and I was surprised that there were a number of use cases mentioned for IP, but I didn't find any of them really convincing. They were all more about putting the IP assets on the blockchain, putting trade secrets on the blockchain. There were a few companies around that kind of time-stamped using some kind of hash algorithms and homographic encryption to create kind of digital time-stamped assets, etc. But I found this much more intriguing to say, isn't there's this built-in feature of smart contracts that enables these transactions. Isn't that something that should be of interest to the IP world and the licensing industries? And that's then we came up with this project idea, had a grant, could onboard Damiano, who did the programming of our initial prototype and actually has been really the technical driving force of that. And we've shown this concept to different senior management people in the licensing world, and they've basically said, well, this sounds really interesting. So are you doing this as a spin out now, as a startup? That was never really the plan, but we said, well, let's see how that goes. And at the moment, we are working with a few companies to set up initial pilot projects to drive that forward and see. Well, we're curious ourselves to see where the journey will take us.
Perfect. Thanks for that summary. And my first question would go to Alex here. Frank just described a little bit the journey from the, let's say, passive notarization use case thinking that dominated, let's say, 3, 4, 5 years ago, when just the patent itself should be basically timestamped and put on a blockchain for better, maybe transparency. And now we talk about this, let's say, ideally end-to-end automation. And we will talk about hardware-based trust oracles a little bit later on in the discussion. But maybe, Alex, from your research in this field and with your background as a lawyer, maybe you could summarize where this kind of use case discussion and this sector is currently moving. What have you observed?
Yeah, it's actually a quite interesting topic, I have to say in general. The problem we have with licenses is that we have two different types of licenses. We have exclusive licenses versus non-exclusive licenses, and this is also something which one should take into consideration. And as Frank mentioned before, beforehand, mostly cases were brought up where basically people try to bring the IP to the blockchain in the sense of that they try to tokenize it, to make a token out of something. And here we have a completely different approach, which I think is quite interesting, especially if we take into consideration how this could fold out with micropayments. If we, for example, have some very tiny little patent on something where we need a license and we have to pay for that, and then we look at the usage, when is it approached, when is it taken, and what is it actually doing in reality, and how can we price that in? And then we also can estimate how much money that would equal, but of course it's quite difficult to then somehow take this money out of the usage from this procedure of using this patent. And this is, I think, where micropayments are quite interesting and step into this field. And if I understood this correct, this is also something which Alps focuses on indirectly by providing this possibility to calculate through how the usage actually of a patent is. And I think this is quite something unique, which I did not see before. As mentioned before, there are many use cases, of course, which also focus in the area of IP law and how to orchestrate that with blockchain technology. But this is quite a unique approach, I would say. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, if I could jump in there briefly,
yeah, please.
I mean, it's more about real-time payments, and then they can you can of course aggregate micropayments to any kind of intervals that you like, right? You could still sum them up for a month, a day, a week. But the point is really that these payments are calculated accurately, and you also, I mean, some companies told us that basically there is value of getting money quicker, right? Through all these kind of reverse payment flow processes from one to the next actor, you get delays, right? So IP creators sometimes get paid once a year, right? And you don't need to be paid every second, but you want to be paid in a reasonably amount of time. And in fact, by someone holding the money and delaying a payment, they make money out of that, right? And there are big business models built around delaying payments. I mean, we can think very pragmatically about the German supermarket chain Aldi, which is famous for this, of delaying payments to its suppliers and holding large amount of cash, or liquidity. So it's also getting the money to the creators, whether these are in the creative industries or inventors or scientists in the universities, getting the money to them in time, to actually getting the money to those people who have actually created the value, and not having the money sunk by some intermediaries, such as audit firms.
Yes.
Sure. Next question would go to Severin. You mentioned doing business development now for Alps, and of course IP licensing is a very vast playing field. So which industries and which segments are on top of your list right now? Where do you see traction? And given your B2B and IoT focus, how can you, let's say, summarize the feedback that you're getting right now?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sebastian. So in terms of our efforts to do business development, a lot of our work goes into creating awareness about Alps right now. At this point, we have been very much a university R&D project. What we're trying to move towards is being a Web3 startup, potentially with the MVP and be able to generate revenue at some point. That's a long journey. So to get there, what we're trying to do currently is to look at partners and work on use cases with them. And we're looking at different verticals of the IP industry that we can focus on. Frank and Damiano mentioned some of them. IoT is one, semiconductors, another one, telco, automotive, medical, but potentially also the entertainment and creative industry, which has a higher blockchain adoption than the other industries we mentioned. So we're looking at partners that are primarily licensors or tech providers, company that have complexity to manage in terms of licensing agreement, licensee across industry, across countries. So that's one type of partners we're engaging with. Another one are the patent pools. They aggregate also patents from a multitude of licensors. And the third type of partners we're discussing with are IP advisory firms, because they have a lot of expertise and contact in this industry in terms of how to monetize IP assets, how to manage these IP transactions. So again, we're talking to a few players and we're trying to have letter of intents being signed and move on with building these use cases, these real life use cases, to showcase that Alps can become a reality. Maybe Frank, you want to weigh in, because I've been involved with this since the summer, so I don't have the complete history, but I think this is where we are right now.
Yeah,
let me ask you a specific question, Frank. Since you mentioned ARM, and of course the chipset manufacturers are, let's say, an obvious target here, not only because they are typically holding patent pools, but also they can solve the trust issue if we talk about real world data being imported into the blockchain. So do you really talk to them about, let's say, certain types of crypto chips, and that they can not only be at the end of, at the beginning of the IP value chain, but also at the end of the data or usage data value chain? Is this a trend that you are trying to establish on top of anything else?
Trends are always difficult to establish.
I
mean, that sounds quite powerful, I think. So, and I mean, something I would say, we are not talking very much about crypto chips or not even Web3 when we speak to companies. We're talking about the idea that this is a business process that, if being digitized, it creates value. And as kind of Severin was already mentioning, we've been doing quite a bit of thinking around which of these ecosystem actors would have benefits from this. And I do have another slide that I could just bring up here, which summarizes this a little bit. And Severin mentioned the patent pools. So the patent pools are obviously another type of intermediary that you can argue we don't really need, right? But on the other hand, these patent pools, they get money from the licensees, and then they are responsible to report to their pool members, to the licensors, what money they got, and have to distribute that. So they have tensions themselves. And that's the reason why we think they could possibly be interested in this and have an interest to digitize that. We've also seen that the licensors probably in general, for some use cases, have more of an interest to get this pushed into the market and digitized than the licensees. And we've been thinking about incentives. So why would a licensor kind of transition their licensees from a paper-based contract to a digital contract, right? And one argument there is that actually if you get the users to engage in these pay-per-use models and contribute to them, as a licensor, you can offer your licensee, that being a manufacturer, a little discount and say, well, actually, if you pay us only 50%, and then the lifetime payments, pay-per-use payments by the users together, reduced payment from the licensee, they create more value over the total life cycle to the licensor, to the IP creators. So the licensors, and obviously they have that reporting issues, they often pay for the audits, etc. So they seem to be the ones that are in a good position to possibly adopt this technology platform.
Yeah, no, those are totally valid, I think, market observations. And sorry for running maybe a bit ahead, but of course the trust issue and the real world data oracles are a not problem of blockchain, but a problem of generally reporting industry data. So I think that might be the end game for machine-based data reporting and automation place. But in the meantime, the efficiency, let's say, pitch is certainly the best way to get into these markets. Alex, from a legal perspective,
if I can just add one thing, because at the moment, I mean, we don't really have plans to financially leverage the data, because also there is this, as Damiano was outlining, there is this privacy wish of all the licensees and licensors to have, obviously, the transactions anonymized. But at the moment, I don't think anyone is really monetizing the value of licensing data, because it's also often not available and so on. So, but in a distributed network, and that's what we would kind of avoid here, there would not be the next big Google or Amazon who would be the Datenkrake. So that would really make a lot of money out of the data, because of the way how, and that's, as you and others know here in this group, that's one of the promises of the distributed architectures we're talking about, right? That in Europe, we don't want to replicate the kind of American centralized model, but we want to have a model that works more towards kind of our societal promises and where we want things to go with privacies and so on. So there's more alignment with that model, I would argue.
Yeah, sure. And I wasn't referring to data markets. I was more referring to data as trigger points, as threshold values. If you want to install pay-per-use, of course, settlement systems, then you need some real world data to judge when, for example, a usage period has begun, started, or ended. Alex, from the legal perspective, anything you want to add here, or where do you see, let's say, future interesting discussion points or bottlenecks, also given incoming regulation?
Yeah, of course, there are many things one has to take into consideration with this project. It's quite interesting. I think, yeah, for example, one has to ask the question, what is if somebody, for example, brings out a license and eventually decides to terminate the license, termination rights. Under what conditions, for example, can the license be terminated? What will happen if somebody will violate afterwards the license and so on? Something like that. That would also be something interesting which just came to mind, how this is orchestrated. Then, do you have a kind of, I don't know, a process in the system which you want to build the MVP of, where things like that are also approached and taken into consideration?
I think That would be a question that Damiano could address. I mean, we've been discussing that, and we've been building the system in such a way that license not only can be terminated, but also that licenses can be updated, right? Things in reality do change, and you might agree on something, and then you suddenly recognize, okay, that kind of model doesn't work, so we need to update it. And that is something we've been considering.
Yeah, if I may add, smart contracts are immutable, so they cannot be changed. But this only means that they can only be changed according to the logic that was originally intended. So if the two participants do put some clauses in the contract to say, in a smart license, I mean, not in the contract, in the bundle of contracts, to say, okay, but if we both agree, so if we both say, okay, we can revise this, or if something external happens, then we can revise the smart license. It can be easily revised. Okay, so in practice, this does not mean that we change the contract, which is impossible, but just that we basically override the old contract with a new one with the new instructions that we both agreed upon. So do not, confuse immutability with a monolithic approach or a lack of flexibility, let's say.
Yeah, I think this is a very good point to take this into consideration. So I think this is already well done. And I was wondering, how are you dealing with geographic and temporal scope? Like, for how long can a license be used, or is it worldwide? How do you deal with different jurisdictions? That is something which just came up now. Because as you said, with smart contracts, difficult to change only if you have a backdoor in there. How do you prepare this?
From a technical point of view, I do not think we have yet thought about jurisdiction. I think this is a bit, beyond the original prototype, right? Now we are even just running on Ethereum, which is just a smaller use case. In the bigger picture, we want to support different PLT protocols, right? So maybe this is more a question for you, Frank.
Yeah, I mean, we've been discussing a bit about regulatory issues, and you might have different tax regimes and different kinds of regulations in different countries. So as Damiano said, I mean, we are kind of still, and also as Severin said, this is still a project and the interface between a research project and possibly becoming a spin-out. And obviously, on our roadmap, we would not first start directly with kind of global domination. We would rather be a bit more humble and try to create a few pilot demonstrator cases, possibly in the same jurisdiction. And there are obviously also financial, if you get the moment where you get into financial payment systems, you have a lot of regulations associated with that. And that there are still a few pending questions. Just at least a few.
We nevertheless ask, before we come to a close, a few questions that might go beyond the current status of Alps, but we wanted to talk about the future of IP licensing in general, of course. And let me start with an anecdote from my consulting life. We built an investment vehicle for Professor Karl-Heinz Brandenburg some 10 years ago. And of course, he's quite famous as the inventor of the MP3 audio codec. But of course, he didn't do it privately. It was done while he was employed by Fraunhofer, where he still is today. And I think Thomson at the time was the company that was managing that license pool. So he ran into some issues when Thomson was filing for insolvency. So that's also an interesting point. If you have a blockchain-based systems, then a single failure of a company can certainly be handled a bit better. But he was also telling us an interesting story about the distribution, because many very interesting codecs never saw the day of light. Think of MPEG 7. We talked about updatability, and that was built in that standard, and nevertheless, it never made its way into the industry. So he told us that MP3 didn't really have a launch plan. It was basically a PhD student that put it into an online forum at midnight, saying, this is cool technology that we just work with. And then it went viral from there. So the whole success of this let's say, IP package could only be reaped because there was a very successful distribution of the technology, which was never really planned. So go-to-market and incentive structures are, of course, also quite important, especially if we think about pay-per-use models and innovative business models going forward. So is this something you think will play a big role if we think about automation of not only patents and pieces of software, but also payments? Do we think that incentive schemes should also play a role and new intermediaries should be found? Could be, I don't know, developers in some chat forums. It could be other ways of, let's say, non-traditional dissemination of the underlying pieces of software. What is your view? As I said, let's discuss a little bit also beyond the current state of Alps here. Any feedback from you guys?
I have a few thoughts on that. I'm very happy to go beyond Alps. So I mean, where we are going to, and you mentioned UK a bit, and I mean the UK is certainly going back into the kind of creative industries, and there are some issues here. But in the creative industries, we've seen kind of different approaches in the music streaming platforms, getting the musicians more and better and quicker and faster remunerated. There have been platform trials for photographers, but also, of course, kind of digital art. I mean, I don't want to go too much into that, but I really find that fair in a way that artists would not only benefit from the first sale of their piece, but also participate in future resales of their assets, particularly if the value goes up, right? And there we are in the world of kind of not necessarily small micropayments, but these kind of in time and space disconnected payments that find their way back to the creators, and whether the creators are musicians, artists, or software developers, that's all linked to kind of copyright IP, so a bit different to the more patent protected IP and IoT assets that we've been looking at. But I think that's been discussed for quite a long way, and we've got to come up with technical solutions to make these in time and space disconnected payments back to the original creators possible. And that's where I see Alps, but also there are other companies trying to set up these kind of clearinghouse models, etc., in the creative industries. So I think we're definitely seeing things going in that way. And your example about the MP3 release, the equivalent in the patent world are so-called patent pledges, where you say this is patented IP. Ownership is a patent, compared to ownership being a copyright, where you then attach some open source licenses to it, and you do a patent pledge, you attach a kind of a license to it that's not necessarily asked for some monetary remuneration, but to adherence to certain other kind of requests from the licensors. And that's then becomes obviously more difficult. The Alps platform is focused on the monetary financial flows, but there could also be other types of licenses that are difficult to capture with that model, maybe.
You wanted to add something, Alex, here from your experience?
Yeah, I think this is super interesting. I was also thinking about how it is with people who need a license and don't get that license that easily. So from my own past, I did a few startups when I was younger. We were working with e-paper, actually. This is the stuff you find in Kindle. And we wanted to have a set to build some kind of shields which you could put into the supermarkets to show the prices of products. So it's almost 14, 15 years ago that I did this, was still in school. And we had the problem that we needed such a set and the licenses on that, and they did not provide us this. And in the end, we got a message from them, and they said, this costs you 120,000 euro or something to get a starter kit, which was unbelievable because we were a young startup. And I think this is also quite helpful if there is better and more access for people in the field who need a license, for example, and they don't have to go through these audits, but there is an easy way, maybe a decentralized way to access that and to obtain such a license to then use it to work on something that also has something to do with sustainability, I personally think.
I have one thing to add there, really, which is the other side. I mean, you're talking there of limited willingness to license, but on the other hand, there are a lot of smaller companies, particularly there are so many small companies in the UK. This economy here is much more built around the small businesses versus Germany, where you still have the Mittelstand and the hidden champions and the big automotive companies. But a lot of small companies actually do have technology that they wish to license, that they would like, if someone wants to use this in a non-competing field that they are not serving a market abroad, and they can't really participate in licensing markets because the costs are arbitrary. And they, through a system that they could kind of leverage to engage in licensing markets for a low costs, that would help them, because obviously there are huge costs associated with kind of making sure you get the payments, possibly running audits, etc. And if you don't have that, that lowers the entry barriers into the licensing markets for smaller firms.
One question to all of you out of interest, because over time I had a few consulting projects or startup activities that went into this area, and I always said to myself, the 3D printing business must be one of the sectors where this flourishes, because basically you can control everything from the chipset that is built into those printers, so you could freely, let's say, open source a license or IP attached to a certain printing design. And then if the chip could be a wallet, then you could also automatically kick back everything, and you would not need to worry about, counterfeit printouts, etc. Is this something you have looked at or discussed? What's your personal opinion on the 3D printing sector?
I can say something about this, but maybe others can also join. I mean, maybe just as a first answer to that, additive manufacturing is a big field here. Where I'm based in the Institute for Manufacturing, there have been many projects around additive manufacturing business models. The UK 3D printing companies, etc. And then the acronym that comes to mind when talking about all of that you've just outlined is DRM, right? Digital Rights Management. And there are possibly interfaces for that, and we're seeing this kind of gradually happening. And that's maybe an example that you might not need distributed ledger technologies for that, but at the same time you can also do it with those technologies. And additive manufacturing, from my side, remains an to follow, really. And you've mentioned counterfeit products. That's a huge multi-billion-dollar industry and there are lots of safety issues, quality issues, particularly for like German Mittelstand companies that have issues with that. So yes, I mean, but that whole area of provenance tracking and counterfeits is nothing we have discussed so far specifically within the Alps context.
Thank you. Seth, you wanted to add something? If not, then I would like to move the discussion in a different direction before we come to a close, and also looking about, let's say, joint action in the future. As Bundesblock, because we are a Web3 and blockchain association, we also need to build bridges towards other industry associations. We've seen that under the Gaia X umbrella, all those Sector X consortial initiatives have popped up. We've seen Catena X, and now we have Manufacturing X. And of course, a group such as Manufacturing X would be quite close to your target groups, producing industry, IoT related business. So have you spoken to those industry associations about Alps, or is this something we should intensify together in the future? It would, of course, also be the Association of the German Machinery Industry. You can change acronyms here, but Manufacturing X is just an obvious new constellation in this sector.
We've done a bit of research over the years on the relevant stakeholders, and in order to get this into the market, so we've been coming across Catena X and Manufacturing X, but we've not really approached them because Severin mentioned that we are speaking to a small number of companies at the moment to develop collaborative pilot projects with the aim to then raise some funding. And that's kind of what stretches our resources at the moment. We're all doing this kind of part-time. But some collaboration with a consortium that would be interested in kind of piloting that technology would obviously be fantastic.
Okay, it's great to hear that teaching is not coming to a stop, neither in Cambridge, nor in Pisa, nor in Osnabrück. And before we wrap up, the question about, what do you expect for the next 12 months for both Alps, but also for the future of IP licensing? In which sector or which use case do you think will be the first or the first few to break through? And potentially why? We know that MiCA is now coming, so there's a regulatory framework for parts of Web3 related use cases, but that's more, of course, the financial side. But in this field, which kind of external factors do you see influencing this market segment? To all of you.
Frank, did you want me to maybe give my 2 cents on this, and then you guys can go? It's actually hard to say, Sebastian. It's a good question. Our goal is really to be able to build use cases with the stakeholders that I mentioned before, some big names as licensors, patent pools, IP advisory firms, and build at least 3 use cases with these partners. My personal opinion is that using blockchain is something that is going to be easier with industries that have already accepted the technology and embraced it. I mentioned the creative industry. You've heard about digital art with NFTs. These are things that you can certainly criticize or say, hey, there was a huge hype and a lot of scams, but the reality is that some digital artists have seen a lot of values being able to monetize their work through NFTs, and maybe these days we could talk also about ordinals, the next generation of NFT in the Bitcoin space. So my personal belief is that we should look at these industries that are more keen to look at blockchain as something that they need to leverage in the future to be able to build and have this innovative and flexible business model that we talked about, per use, consumption, and secondary market, be able to monetize things after the first sale. So whilst I don't have a specific industry or use case to mention to you, Sebastian, I would say that this is personally the industries or the people we talk to that are keen to see a blockchain ramp up. This is where I think we should go next.
And
okay,
I think
understood.
I think there are clearly complementarities. I mean, and with the creative industries being already a bit more innovative compared to the rather kind of conservative, traditional kind of manufacturing engineering businesses. I mean, it would be really of interest to bring the different players together who are addressing kind of different parts, different players of these ecosystems. So I think we would be quite open to that, even if there are others who I mean, this is, as we've shown, right? I mean, this is a huge industry, huge sector, and there's I mean, there's a lot of room for various players, and a small Cambridge project is not going to change the way how kind of licensing is being done across the world. So if there's maybe a role for even your association to possibly orchestrate this and bring the different players together. I think that would be fabulous, because yeah, we think this is a really good use case for distributed ledger technologies. And yeah, so we need a critical mass to move this forward.
We'll put it on our agenda for 2025, Alex, to set up the IP DAO and run this properly. Yeah, I fully agree. It must be in, let's say, open platform where companies and experts can join. So as we heard it many times before, collaborate on the infrastructure side of things and then compete at the business level side of things. So this would be quite helpful. Alex, anything you're looking forward to happen in this sector in the next 12 months?
That's a difficult question to answer. I personally, if I refer now to Alps, for example, I believe that such an idea needs a patent, needs a technology that can be patentable. And if that is possible, then there's a big market, I think, that is open for something like that, which has the potential to change the world. And I think it's an excellent use case for DLT, especially if you put some specific things from DLT to this idea, then I think this can be something which also would be quite interesting in the blockchain environment. Yeah. But concerning the field of license in general, this is a not fast-moving field in general. It's, I think, very difficult to bring big players to the point where they change their minds on that. They did this for decades, and this is something where one has to break in, because as Frank just mentioned, I think it's important that small startups have the possibility to license their ideas. And on the other hand, from my experience, it used to be quite difficult to get hands on a license, and all these audits are a bit ridiculous. 3-4 million euro, as the company in Cambridge had to pay for these audits every year. You could use this in a better way, I think. Yeah.
Totally agreed. My last 10 cents on this would be that I think patent pools are really a good target segment because they're doing this for the sakes of efficiency, and of course also they want to leverage the pools they have, so they should be quite open to this kind of a more automated, flexible, fast approach. And there you automatically also have a few partners that form a consortium and that do certainly know about the trust issues around it. So thank you a lot for this discussion today about the future of IP licensing. We see that the blockchain tech capabilities are potentially allowing us to build infrastructure platforms that has different layers and that can evolve over time and grow into quite a powerful platform. Thanks to Professor Frank Tietze, thanks to Dr. Damiano Francesco Maesa from the University of Pisa, thanks to Severin Bonnet from the University of Osnabrück, Alex Hannemann from Bundesblock, and we hope to see you soon. Our next webinar is in exactly 13 minutes about industrial blockchain. So if you switch to the INATBA Digital Blockchain Week, you might be able to see at least me again. And we are certainly going to follow up on this topic. The webinar has been recorded and will be made available on YouTube for further decentralized distribution without any royalty schemes attached before the end of the week. So see you soon. Thank you for this discussion and goodbye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Sebastian.
Thanks
Very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a
Bye.
pleasure.